I want to welcome you to the 10 Essentials for Managing Congregational Human Resources. I'm Lisa Presley, the District Executive for the Heartland District here in Mid-America, and I'm pleased to welcome you all. And I'm especially pleased to welcome Rob Molla. Rob is our expert this evening, and he is the Director of Human Resources at the Unitarian Universalist Association. His job is to keep all the employees in line as much as possible, from a human resources point of view. And I have found it to be an absolute delight working with him and find him a very wonderful font of information. So, Rob, I will turn this over to you to begin.
Thanks, Lisa, and welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you tonight. And we've got a full agenda for you on all kinds of information around managing the human resources function, managing the personnel function at your congregations. I've been with the UUA about 4.5 years now, and I'm responsible for benefits, employee relations, compensation, training, just about every aspect, recruiting of every aspect of the HR function there. And I work closely with our Office of Church Staff Finances, which interfaces with congregations on issues of compensation, benefits, and taxation, and closely with our district staff, our really excellent district staff, of whom I'm incredibly appreciative that works closely with the congregations on all kinds of other personnel issues as well. So I thought what I'd share with you tonight is some of the types of issues that I oftentimes get questions about, kind of in random order. Not one is more important than the other, but I think that you'll find out that given the size of your congregations, when you introduced yourself tonight, we've got folks from 135 up to 310 in your congregations. I'm on the personnel committee at my congregation here in Massachusetts at First Parish Unitarian Universalist in Duxbury, Massachusetts, and we're just over 300. And I can tell you, even though they're fortunate enough, and I pat myself on the back here, to think that they have the HR director of the UUA sitting on their personnel committee, we have all of these issues too. So I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this. These kind of issues are things that every personnel committee, every HR committee, and every HR person has to deal with. And they're not just specific to congregations, although some of these are. They're actually common to every organization that has to manage personnel function as well, although some of the issues that are specific to congregations are a little bit different. So I'll take you through some issues around setting up the personnel files. We'll talk about job descriptions, the Form I-9, which is a required form that the federal government requires for all personnel. We'll talk a little bit about Title VII issues.
And may I just interrupt for a moment and ask people if you could mute your phone, because we're picking up things like keyboard clicks and that. You can either do it from a mute button on your phone if you have it, or *6 will mute you, and then it will also unmute you when you have questions. Thank you.
We'll talk about how to set up the personnel manual if you don't have one already, or things that you might want to think about including in your personnel manual if you've started working on one. The differences between an employee and a consultant. When you bring new staff into a congregation, or if you have existing staff, you may need to rethink whether you've classified them as employees or independent contractors. We'll look at the issues around fair benefits and compensation, and I'll let you know what's available through the UUA and how to set up some basic practices around benefits and comp. If you're paying your staff, when they should be exempt or non-exempt from the overtime laws, whether you're paying them salary or hourly. We'll talk around some issues that come up when you're communicating a termination and how that would affect the members of your congregation. And I'll point you to some resources as well. So we'll start from here. Lisa, if you could switch us to the next slide, that would be great. Thanks. So first things first, setting up a personnel file. I know from experience, it's certainly in my congregation when I started with the personnel committee, there were there was information all over the place, scattered everywhere, having to do with our different staff members. And it was pretty hard to gather this up and figure out who was paid what the original hire letters promised them. So what I suggest that every organization has, every congregation has, is a personnel file. And typical things that you would include in a personnel file would be all materials that involve the hire of your employee. So if you're in search for a minister or your DRE, or if you're hiring your administrator, you'd include the applications, hire letters, copies of job descriptions, things like that you'll want to put in the personnel file. Anytime you change a person's pay rate or their benefits, you'll want to keep copies of those pay rate changes in the personnel files. When you're having them sign up for benefits, you're going to want to put copies of the election forms in the personnel file. If they elect the benefit, and conversely, if they decide that they don't want the benefit, you should make sure that they fill out the benefit election form saying, yes, I'm choosing it, or no, I'm not taking it, signing and dating that and putting that in the file. You certainly want to keep copies of the refusal of benefits forms because if anything ever happens in the future, say somebody rejects a disability benefit that you're offering them, and then a few months or a few years later, unfortunately, they're hurt, they're injured, and they need to apply for disability, and they say to you, well, I was never offered that benefit. You can go back to the file and you can say, look, here's where you rejected it. I know that congregations oftentimes feel responsible and end up paying out of pocket when things like this happen, so it's a good way to protect yourself. Any copies of performance reviews and evaluations will should eventually be filed in the personnel file. Of course, you want everything signed and dated. And what I do is we have in my HR office, we keep just a stamp, a date stamp. So when things come into us, we just stamp it with today's date and put it in the file that way, so we know when it comes to us. You're going to want to keep all of these things in a locked and secured cabinet. They should not be accessible to people. You know, I'm thinking most congregations probably have an administrator's office where these things might be kept in a file cabinet. You'll want that file cabinet locked and secured. You don't want different members of the congregation or other people coming in and out of your offices to have access to these things. They contain personal information. We have an expectation of privacy, and we have obligations to protect personal information, including Social Security numbers, listings of dependents and perhaps children's Social Security numbers, benefits forms and things like that. So you'll want to keep that all locked and secured. And one of the conversations you'll want to have either as a governing board, as a personnel committee, or as a minister who may be serving as chief of staff with your staff or your board, is who should have access to these things. And typically, I would say keep it restricted as much as possible to perhaps the chair of the board, the chair of the personnel committee, because you don't want people going in and out of these files, again, because of the privacy information. There's a couple of things you'll want to keep separate from the personnel file, and you may want to keep it in the same locked file cabinet, but my recommendation to you is to keep 4 parts of the personnel file. The things I just mentioned can go in one file, and then keep separate files for background check information. If you're following safe congregation practices and doing background checks, query checks, criminal background investigations, perhaps you're doing financial background investigations on your treasurer or the people who handle money in your congregation. If you're doing sexual predator checks or criminal record checks on those folks who are working with children, you'll want to keep the results of those background checks separate from the personnel forms, from the rest of the personnel file. It could be that a supervisor wants to go in and see what the recent pay rate changes were and the job description and job description updates were for his or her employee, but you don't want them to have access to the background checks. You'll keep the I-9 form separate. We'll talk about the I-9 in a couple of minutes. But the I-9 form can be audited. The Department of Labor or the Department of Homeland Security can come in and has a right to audit your I-9 records. And you'll want to keep those separate because you don't want government agencies digging through the rest of your personnel files, because they could dig up things that you don't want them to see, and open up other cans of worms potentially. And then any medical record information. Say you have one of your staff members who applies for disability benefits or who's applying for family medical leave for medical issues, for pants. You'll want to keep those separate as well. And again, everything in a locked and secured file cabinet. Next slide, please, Lisa. Now, the things I'm talking about tonight, there's lots of stuff here, and it can be scary to think that you haven't done each and every one of these things, and good heavens, you've got this huge volume of work ahead of you to be running a clean personnel function in your congregation. But my suggestion to you is take things one piece at a time. Think of this as years-long projects. And so if you tackle one small piece at a time, it's not so overwhelming. And the job descriptions can be one of those small pieces that you tackle little by little. So why do you have job descriptions? Job descriptions are really helpful for when you start your recruiting process, when you start your hiring process. If you're looking for an administrator or a custodian, a sexton for your congregation, start with a job description. You'll think through the number of hours per week that person might need to work, their schedules, what the salary range would be, how much time they're going to be spent on different duties. There are things like what kind of education you'll require, what kind of experience you'll require. And all of these things can be helpful when you're writing your advertisements or if you're going into search for a position. So, and another reason that job descriptions can be particularly useful is around evaluations. And I'm not going to speak at all about evaluations tonight. It's a big topic. We could probably do an entire seminar just on evaluations. And Lisa can point you to some great information on uua.org for evaluations. But job description sets you out on the right path to doing evaluations where you can set out clear expectations and you can start establishing appropriate goals in consultation with your staff. And you need a good, clear job description to be able to do appropriate evaluations. So again, it's another reason to have good, thoughtfully put together job descriptions. So these are the things that you're going to include in your job description. As I said, a title, the number of hours per week. It's important to think about hours per week because benefits eligibility oftentimes is dependent on the number of hours per week or per year that an employee works for your organization. Certainly UUA benefits are dependent upon number of hours that an employee works. The schedule a person will work, the salary range, whether they're exempt or not from overtime, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. You'll give a basic purpose for the job. How does this job fit within the mission of your congregation? You'll describe the essential functions of the job and the approximate time spent on each job, on each function, and these would be the duties. What are the essential duties? And I use the term essential functions because with issues of around the Americans with Disabilities Act, you'll want to specify clearly what the essential functions are and not what the extraneous or other functions are, because you'll want the employee to be able to perform the essential duties of the job with or without reasonable accommodation under the ADA. You'll set up reporting relationships and supervisory responsibilities. Who reports to this person and who does this person supervise? It's oftentimes pretty helpful to have that clarity up front. I can tell you the number of times I've spoken with folks in congregations, and you ask, well, and they're having an issue with one of their staff members, and I ask them a simple question, well, who's the supervisor? And they can't tell me that. So think through that in the first place. What are the minimum requirements for the position? Think about education, experience, skills, certifications, etc. What are the working conditions and physical or mental requirements? For a custodian, for example, they'd need to be able to stoop and bend, maybe lift boxes or equipment, move tables and chairs around up to 25 or 30 pounds, maybe more. And those are things you would want to certainly include in your job description. And you always want a line that says, performs additional duties as assigned. And that's a great protection line for you because it gets you out of the response when you ask somebody to do something that may not be detailed in the job description. You don't want to hear the response, well, that's not in my job description, so I'm not going to do that. So if you include that performs additional duties as assigned line, you'll be protecting yourself pretty well. Next slide, please, Lisa. The Form I-9. Now, what this is, it's a form that's required by every employer in the United States, whether you're a religious organization or not. We are not exempt from the Form I-9. It's required by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and what it does is it proves every worker's identity and eligibility to work in the United States. You can find all kinds of information about the I-9 form at the website that I list here, www.uscis.gov/I-9Central. And USCIS is the Citizenship and Immigration Service of the federal government. And there's a fairly straightforward form, although it has some complications to it, that you need to ask each of your employees to fill out. It doesn't matter what size employer you are, whether you have one employee or 10,000 employees. Every employee needs to fill it out. And then you, as the employer, have to certify it by signing off on it. And to prove identity and work eligibility, the I-9 form gives you a number of documents that will serve those purposes. For example, a U.S. passport proves both identity and work eligibility. It proves that you're a United States citizen, so you can work here, and because it has a picture of you, and it's been certified by the government, it shows who you are. Other typical documentation that is accepted, oftentimes people will give you a Social Security card. The Social Security card only proves work eligibility. It doesn't prove identity. And so people oftentimes give a driver's license, a copy of a driver's license, and the I-9 form will allow the driver's license for identity. But you'll see a whole list of documentation that is acceptable there. You're not allowed to specify which documents the employee gives. As long as they're on the I-9 form, the employee can choose any of those documents as long as they fill the requirements for identity and work eligibility. And that website, there's an employer's manual there. It's worth reading through because if you've got, every once in a while, you may have to recertify eligibility, and it tells you when to do that and how to do that. And there's also requirements to keep these forms for a certain number of years. It's either 3 years after initial application, 1 year after hire, or 3 years after termination of employment, or I have it backwards. But the I-9 Central will tell you what those retention requirements are. So again, you'll want to keep these in a secure, locked file cabinet because it has such important personal information on it. Again, you can keep them in the same cabinet with your personnel files, but I'd keep them separate from the personnel files in case the Citizenship and Immigration Service ever decides to audit your I-9 records. And they may do that. It's rare for them to go after church organizations, but not unheard of. Now, I suggest that you may want to have a board discussion about this or some sort of personnel committee discussion about whether you want to do this or not. I've heard of a few congregations that have felt that this is not something that they want to do because for them it's a way that they can protest the deplorable state of immigration in this country. And so they do it as a bit of civil disobedience. And you should know that if you choose not to do the I-9 forms, fines can be incredibly high, up to $25,000 per I-9 form that isn't completed. And there could be potential jail time if it's done willfully as well. So it's something that you'll certainly want to take very seriously if you choose not to do it. And if you haven't done them in your congregations yet, they're required now for every employee hired after November of 1986, I believe. So if you've got staff working who've been hired in your congregation after 86, you should have an I-9 on file for them. Next slide, please, Lisa. One more thing about the I-9. You don't have to photocopy the documents that the employee gives you, but you may want to photocopy and keep them with the I-9. One, it proves that you've done some goodwill. You've been faithful about looking at the documents carefully. And the other thing is the UUA benefits, which many congregations sign up for. Part of their audit requirements are things like copies of driver's licenses. They have to be able to prove age and oftentimes addresses for your staff through these type of documents. So if you keep photocopies of the driver's license and Social Security card, those might be helpful if the Office of Church Staff Finances ever asks you to give information for their audits. Title VII. One of the things that I hear from congregations around hiring is they want to know if they can specify whether they can hire a person who is a Unitarian Universalist. So can you say that somebody you hires has to be a UU? Well, the short answer is yes. And this has to do with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was signed into being by President Johnson, which prohibits discrimination based on age, religion, gender, race, ethnicity, national origin or citizenship, all of those things that we think about that you shouldn't discriminate against. It does exempt churches from discrimination based on religion. So if we want to hire just a UU, we certainly can specify that if we want to. But I urge you to be careful. At the UUA, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold here. At the UUA, for example, we try not to specify whether we need a UU unless it's really important. If we're hiring a minister, for example, we look at the requirements very carefully about whether we actually need to hire a minister who's fellowshipped with the Unitarian Universalist Association. So I urge you to think about that very carefully. Certainly if you're hiring a minister in your congregation, you probably want them to be a UU minister. But do you really need your church administrator to be a UU? Do you need your sexton or your custodian to be a UU? Does your music professional need to be a UU? So ask yourself these questions before you make that a requirement. So when you're working on your recruiting processes, when you're selecting your staff, when you're interviewing folks, I urge you to focus on things like skill sets, what their work style preferences are. Think about whether they would get along well, whether they would be cooperative, whether they'd make great teammates, whether they'd exercise leadership with other members of the staff and with folks in your congregation. What's their availability? Are they available for the hours you need them to be available? Ask lots of open-ended questions. Avoid yes/no questions. and ask behavioral questions. And we talk about behavioral interviewing in personnel and in the human resources field. Behavioral questions are things like, can you tell me about a time when you didn't get along with your supervisor, what the situation was, and how you handled that, how you resolved the situation. So these kinds of questions, the idea is past behavior predicts future performance. So you can find out how they handled difficult situations or tricky situations, and how they might work with situations that come up in your congregation. If you can avoid them, avoid questions around age or date of birth, marital family status, disabilities, national origin or citizenship, race or ethnicity, and affiliations. In affiliations, things like club memberships. Are they in the country club? Typically, country club memberships, things like that, were exclusive to certain religions, or excluded people from different ethnic groups or different religious groups, so you may want to avoid things like that. Next slide, please, Lisa. If you don't have a policy handbook, an employee handbook, or a policy manual, I strongly suggest you think about it. And again, putting together a policy manual is one of those immense tasks that could take years to put together. They're living documents. They're always changing. They always need to be updated. There's always something to add, tweak, and edit. So start simple. And a great place to start is if you go on to uua.org/HR, you scroll down to the policy section, and there's a bunch of questions about where you can find a model personnel policy manual. And our Office of Church Staff Finances has put together a basic manual that congregations can use as a starting point for putting together a policy manual, for putting together a handbook. And so it will include these type of things. There'll be an introduction to your congregation, the history of the congregation, the structure of your organization. There'll be a section on basic employment policies and practices. So these are kind of the things that you would want to include there. Policies around harassment, if you have a code of ethics, conflict of interest policies, policies around use of email or the internet, whether you can employ relatives or members of your congregation, when performance or evaluations are done, issues around safety and reporting of accidents. You certainly want any staff member who's hurt to be able to report that accident in case there's insurance implications, could be liability insurance implications, or workers' comp required workers' comp reporting. Or OSHA reporting. Many states require reporting of accidents. You'll want policies around safe congregations and background checks. Professional and appropriate behavior, things like that would be included in this section. You'll want a section on wage and hour administration. So what the typical hours of work are, when your work week starts, when your work week ends for timekeeping purposes, how timekeeping is handled, when timesheets are done, how those are managed, what the pay schedule is, when overtime is paid, things like that, when breaks are managed. I don't know. I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation with church administrators, and they call me and ask me about whether they're allowed to take breaks and how long they get to take breaks. And of course, every state has different labor laws. Some states require breaks, some don't. In Massachusetts, for example, if you work 6 or more hours, you're required to give your staff an unpaid half-hour meal break, but there's no other required breaks. So everybody in Massachusetts kind of has this sense that you're allowed 15-minute breaks every few hours, but the law doesn't actually require that. So you want to put those kind of things in your policy manual. And then you certainly include a section on benefits, what the eligibility for benefits is, what insurances are available, retirement, for example, paid time off benefits, including vacation, sick time, personal time, what those are used for, what's allowed under those categories. So, for example, if your children are sick, does that count as sick time or is that personal time? So you'll want to define things like that. What holidays your congregation observes for paid staff, who's eligible for sabbatical and what the rules are around sabbaticals, leaves of absence. What if somebody needs to take family leave to care for one of their family members? How would you manage that? Or what if somebody wanted to take a leave for personal reasons? An unpaid leave for personal reasons, how would you manage that? Policies around vehicle usage, reimbursement for mileage, cell phone usage while driving on congregation business. All of those things are the kind of things that you may want to think about in your policy manual. And I give you some questions here on this slide, and these are big questions, I think, that I see all the time. Can you hire from within your congregation? So you're thinking about hiring a congregational administrator, and one of your members, your congregation members, is interested in that job. Is that somebody that you would allow to have in the congregation? In my congregation, for example, we don't permit that. It's a conflict of interest for us, and so we don't permit that, for example. Do you allow outside employment? So would you allow your administrator to have another job? And how would you define those limits of eligibility for working outside the organization? Leaves of absence I mentioned. What happens to my sick time or vacation time if I quit? Some states require payout of sick or vacation time. You should know about that. Other states don't require that, and you may want to be generous and pay that out if somebody leaves the organization. How do you handle allegations of harassment? I hear all the time about people who send inappropriate things through the email or post things on the congregation's internet site. So how do you want to handle those kind of things? You should have a thoughtful email policy, thoughtful electronic usage policies. Staff should know that email and internet belongs to the congregation, and that the congregation, that those things may not be private. So these are kind of things that you'll include in your policy manual. And again, it's overwhelming. So make sure you start with, if you don't know where to start with that sample policy manual that the Office of Church Staff Finances puts out. Next slide, please, Lisa. So one of the confusions that I oftentimes hear from congregations is whether they should hire somebody as an employee or whether they should hire somebody as an independent contractor or a consultant. And oftentimes you have folks working in your congregations as consultants when they really should be employees. And the IRS is on the lookout for these kind of misclassifications. They've gone after organizations incredibly over the past 2 or 3 years. They're really beefing up compliance around these issues. And there's no simple answer to whether somebody working for your congregation should be an employee or a consultant. If you have to err on one side or the other, I would always suggest bringing the person in as an employee, and you could bring them in as a temporary employee without benefits rather than as a consultant. But the IRS has set up a set of 20 questions, and the questions have to do with issues around control, financial payment. And so here are some of the questions that they look at. So who determines the hours of work, the workplace, and the type of work that they're doing? Is it the congregation? If it's the congregation, then the person is an employee. But if the person that is working for you can say, I'm going to do the work at my home. I'm going to do the work whenever I want. I'm going to, manage this myself and deliver a product, for example, to you, give you a deliverable. That looks like a consultant to the IRS. Does the person have their own advertised business? Do they have their own workers' compensation policy? Have they incorporated in your state? If they have, they're probably an independent consultant. Are they offering their services to other organizations? If so, they're probably an independent consultant. If they're not, you probably need to bring them in as an employee. Can they outsource the work to other people? So if your person can, say you hire somebody to do a website for you, and they decide they want little parts of the website outsourced to other people who are working for them or other people that they know, that person's probably a consultant. But if you're requiring them to do it all themselves, then that person's most likely an employee. Can they quit, or have they signed a contract to do the work and complete the project? If they can quit at any time, they're probably an employee. But if they have a contract that requires completion of the project, they're probably a consultant. Are you paying them little by little? Are you giving them a weekly or monthly paycheck? That person's probably an employee. Unless you're paying them when the whole project is completed, then they're probably a consultant. And again, how long this lasts, if it's ongoing year after year, they're probably an employee and not a consultant. I know of congregations that for example, think that because they have somebody working 5 or 10 hours a week as a custodian, they're just going to pay them a check through their accounts payable as a consultant, as an independent contractor, when really what they are is a temporary employee or even a long-term employee, and you should be withholding taxes and things like that for them. So next slide, please, Lisa. So employees are eligible for benefits. Contractors aren't. Employees need to fill out a W-4 tax form, which you can find on www.statew4.com. It's a great website for finding all kinds of tax forms, www.statew4.com. Contractors don't fill out W-4s. They fill out a W-9 form instead. It's similar, but slightly different. Every January, your employees receive a W-2 showing what wages you've paid to them and how much taxes you've withheld for them. Contractors receive a 1099 form, which basically shows that you're not withholding any taxes for them, and it shows how much income they've been paid so that they can report their own taxes. And be careful with this. Most states now are requiring employers, and that means congregations too, to report their employees to the state and to report their contractors, their consultants to the state for purposes of, so the states can find these people for back taxes, for child support if they haven't been paying child support, so they can garnish their wages. And most states have online systems. If you go into the State Department of Labor website, where you can actually do these, where you can actually report your employees, and typically or contractors, and typically what they ask is the person's name, the hire date or the start date as a contractor, the Social Security number, their address and phone number, and your information, your federal employee ID number or your state employer ID number, so that they can hunt down these folks if they need to come after them for back taxes, wage garnishments, and things of that nature. And you want to make sure you do that. If you're using a payroll service, check with your payroll service or your bookkeeper, if your bookkeeper is doing your payroll, to see if that person is doing the mandatory state reporting, because you'll certainly want to do that as well. Next slide, please, Lisa. Compensation. Compensation and benefits is probably one of the trickiest areas that we have to deal with on the personnel side in our congregations. The Office of Church Staff Finances, which is an office in our ministries and faith development staff group at the UUA. The Office of Church Staff Finances should be your best friend if you're a minister who serves as head of staff, or if you're a board member at the congregation, or if you're a personnel committee at your congregation. They have all kinds of resources to help you set up appropriate benefits, appropriate compensation for the staff who worked for you. What they suggest is a fair compensation model, and this is what's included in the fair compensation model. It includes a salary plus housing allowance if the person is ordained. Should be paying FICA, which is Social Security, and Medicare for that person, and that's basically 7.65% of salary plus housing. You should be offering a uniform set of benefits to all eligible employees, and on the next slide I'll show you what eligibility should look like. But what they typically suggest is that you pay 80% for the employee's portion of health insurance and 50% for the dependent portion of health insurance. You should be paying for life insurance, or at least offering life insurance, and offering disability insurance, and impute the income if it's employee paid. Now, the one thing about disability you should know, disability insurance is critically important. Say you have one of your staff, you've hired your staff, they've been working with you for many years, they're getting out of their car, they're walking across the street, coming into the office, and they're struck down. And suddenly they're not able to work. They're going to be out of work for years. They're disabled. If they don't have disability insurance, the congregation feels this incredible guilt and necessity to help with their income. How are they going to pay their mortgage? How are they going to pay their rent? How are they going to keep their bills paid? And it's an incredible financial burden on the congregation to have to do that, potentially for years. So if the person has disability insurance, which you can get through the UUA Office of Church Staff Finances, it's extremely inexpensive, and it's, as I said, it's incredibly cheap, and it helps with things like that. Fair compensation model suggests a 10% contribution into the retirement plan. The UUA has an extraordinary retirement plan through TIA-CREF that congregations are eligible to participate in. Fair compensation suggests vacation time, professional expenses in the amount of about 10% of salary and housing, and a set of written personnel policies that we've talked about. You'll probably want to set salary ranges based on title and location, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Flip to the next slide, please, Lisa. This gives you a quick, I'm not going to go through this, spend a lot of time going through this, but this gives you a sense of how to budget around compensation and benefits if you're thinking about that. Many congregations are using a total cost of ministry model where they think, okay, let's plan on $70,000 or $75,000 for our minister. And when you break it out like this, you actually realize when you figure out the cost of benefits, when you figure out the cost of insurances, you figure out FICA costs, you figure out professional expenses, that you're actually paying your minister a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of money if you're working through the total cost model. So what I suggest is putting together a budget that looks like this. Figure out what the salary range is that you may want to pay, and then start figuring out the cost of benefits on top of that. And if you go to the next slide, Lisa. I'm sorry. Slide after that. Great. The UUA has a compensation survey, again, through the Office of Church Staff Finances. It's based on geography, it's based on congregation size, that will suggest to you what the appropriate pay ranges, salary ranges are for staff, whether it's music folks, whether it's administrators, whether it's ministers, whether it's custodians, et cetera, in your congregation. And this is incredibly useful for you. And this is all available on the UUA website. If you go to the top of the Church Staff Finances section on the UUA.org.
Rob, there have been a couple of questions typed in the side. If I could just interrupt and ask them. I'm sorry I didn't notice them sooner.
No problem.
Jennifer asks whether or not for, and I believe this would be for hourly employees, but you could comment also for salary, about whether or not you recommend using timesheets, time records of their hours.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's really important to keep track of staff hours. If you're paying, especially if your folks are paid by the hour, you want to keep a detailed record of start time and end time every day that they've worked, and total number of hours worked per week. And this is critically important if you're ever in a situation where there's a question about whether you've paid appropriate overtime or not for that employee. Most states require overtime to be paid over 40 hours per week. And again, that depends on how you define your work week. So you want to, in your personnel manual, include a definition for what time your work week starts. It starts on Sunday at midnight, for example, and runs through Saturday night at 11:59. But however you choose to define that, you'll want to set up your work week that way and keep track of hours. Other states like California, for example, requires overtime to be paid after 8 hours in a work day, not in a work week. And then that can change. It could be, for example, that overtime needs to be paid in California. It goes up to double time and triple time, depending on actually how many hours are worked in a day or on a week. So you really need to be careful about keeping track of hours, especially start and end times for your hourly staff each day. And so what I suggest is you keep just a very simple timesheet that you ask your hourly staff to keep every day for when they start and when they end. For your non-exempt staff, your staff who are exempt from overtime, it's not so critical that they keep start and end times. It's much more important that they just keep track of whether they've taken a day off or a half day off, however you track your paid time off. What we do at the UUA is we ask our staff our salaried staff, our exempt staff, to turn in a monthly timesheet that shows whether they've taken off half days or full days for vacation, for personal time, for sick time, things like that, and whether they've worked full days or half days the other days, so we can track that. It's a little looser for our exempt staff than it is for our non-exempt staff. But if you have non-exempt staff who are paid by the hour, you absolutely need to keep track of their start and end times each day. That's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. And then Alexander also opens up a big can of worms about whether or not music directors are or musicians in congregations in general probably as well, would be considered consultants or employees. Now, I've often thought that they are probably more likely an employee, especially a pianist or an organist, because they're using equipment you provide. They have to show up for work at Sundays at X time or whenever your services are. But I'd love your opinion on this, Rob.
No, I agree with you, Lisa. I think that in most cases, they're working the hours that you require them to. They're working under your supervision. You're telling them what equipment they have to use. This is one of those cases that's not absolutely clear under the IRS guidelines, but I would say that the preponderance of evidence pushes us towards thinking about that person is an employee rather than an independent contractor. And so I would certainly err on the side of hiring that person as an employee, withholding taxes. It doesn't harm you in any way. It only benefits you to do the right thing. If the IRS ever came to you and said, you've misclassified this person wrong, there could be substantial penalties there. I'd much rather see you err on the side of classifying a music person as an employee and withholding taxes for them, reporting taxes appropriately, than not. Again, every situation is slightly different. It may be that you're hiring somebody, you're hiring a musician to come in just to perform at one service. You're maybe hiring a harpist to come in and perform at one special service that you're doing. In that case, it's probably a consultant. But for your music professional, your organist that comes in every week, or your choir director, or if it's your music director who's performing little bits of both of those jobs, playing the organ, directing the choir, I would certainly say it's most likely an employee. Another really great question. Lisa, should I go back?
Yes, please do. I think you hadn't covered the benefits slide, and here it is.
Terrific. Now, I want to give you a sense of what eligibility is under the UUA benefits plans, and I want to, if you haven't done research on these, if you're not involved with the UUA benefits, I'd strongly recommend that you contact our Office of Church Staff Finances, because you may be able to save significant amounts of money by signing up for the UUA benefits plans rather than going out and try to negotiate your own set of benefits on your own. We've got a lot of buying power. Our UUA health plan is extraordinarily rich. It's a terrific plan, and it's very cost-effective in many, many parts of our country. The health plan eligibility starts at 750 hours a year, which is part-time status for 9 months a year for many of our staff. The retirement plan eligibility is through TIA-CREF. It's incredibly well managed, and that eligibility starts at 1,000 hours per year. Most of our ministers who move from congregation to congregation are probably in our UUA retirement plan already, and you should be offering that to other benefit-eligible employees at your congregation. Life, accidental death and dismemberment and disability insurances start at 750 hours. And I suggest that you offer these to the entire staff or the entire staff who are eligible based on these hours worked, because that way you can avoid rankism. Again, I suggest you require election or rejection forms, as I talked about earlier. And if you're offering your benefits, make sure your staff know that they have 60 days from their date of hire to sign up for these benefits. Certainly for the health and disability and life insurances, because otherwise they lose eligibility and may not be able to sign up for them at all unless there's some sort of qualifying event. Lisa, if we can skip forward 2 slides, please. I think Alexander is asking if 2/3 of eligible employees must participate in the plan before any employee can participate in the plan. That's exactly right. You need to offer it to, I believe it's 70% of the employees on your staff before you can make contributions on behalf of your. Typically, what happens is congregations want to offer it to the minister, but not to other members of the staff. So I believe the requirement is that it has to be offered to 70% of the other employees, 70% of all the employees in the congregation, of eligible employees within the congregation, before the congregation can make a contribution on behalf of the minister. And I believe it has to be offered to them, not participate. But I'm not 100% sure on that, Alexander. You'll definitely want to check with the Office of Church Staff Finances on that. And the person about the retirement plan, your contact there is Joyce Stewart, who's really accurate. She can tell you everything you want to know about the retirement plan. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about salaried employees or hourly employees. Hourly staff are paid by the hour worked. Salaried staff are paid by the week worked, typically. Salaried staff would be your minister, perhaps. Hourly staff would probably be your church administrator. It might be your custodian, for example. Just because you pay your employee a salary doesn't mean they're exempt from overtime pay. People oftentimes make the mistake of thinking, oops, I'm going to pay this person a salary so we don't have to worry about overtime pay. And that is wholly incorrect. So if you flip to the next slide, please, you'll see that under the Fair Labor Standards Act, all employees are considered non-exempt, which means they are not exempt from the overtime laws, meaning you have to pay them overtime unless you exempt them. And how do you exempt them from the overtime laws? Next slide, please. They're exempt from the overtime laws if they make at least $455 per week, which is a significant amount of money. So if your church administrator isn't making at least $455 a week, that person is not exempt from overtime. You have to be making sure you're tracking that person's every hour worked, and if they work more than 40 hours in a week, you have to pay them time and a half or whatever your state requires. So there's a salary test, and there's also certain exemptions if they perform executive duties, high-level administrative duties. And high-level administrative duties is not being an administrative assistant in most cases. It would be performing high-level administrative duties for the organization. So, for example, at the UUA, the executive vice president or the chief operating officer would be considered an administrative exemption from the overtime laws. Professionals would be your ministers. Ministers would be exempt if they earn at least $455 a week. Outside salespeople, which you probably don't have, and some of the largest congregations may have computer professionals, and they may be exempt from the overtime laws too. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about compensation and whether you should be tracking your employees by the hour and paying them by the hour or not.
And Rob, just to give you a time check, we have about 10 minutes left of our scheduled time.
Great. I've got one more slide and then some resources, and we'll be all set. So one particularly problematic area around that I hear is what happens if you have to terminate an employee? How do you communicate that to the congregation? Or what is the congregation's right to know about that, the reasons behind that termination or separation of employment? So consider this. You have an employee, you have a staff member who is problematic for some reasons, and you need to let that person go. You'll certainly have some folks in the congregation who come up and they'll say, and they may raise a big stink, they may not, but I've seen it happen, where they'll say, we have a right to know exactly what the issues are, why you let that person go. You know, it's part of our democratic process. It's one of our 7 principles that we believe in, that open democratic process. You know, for the sake of transparency, you need to tell us why that person was let go. Or it could be the case that the former employee is actually talking to people and saying, here are the reasons why they fired me. But you as the employer and you as the congregation, which is the employer, have a certain obligation to protect that employee's confidentiality. Whether the employee protects his or her own confidentiality, you have an obligation to protect that employee's confidentiality to avoid lawsuits around defamation. So you can't go, theoretically, you shouldn't be going to your congregation and say, we let person X go because, and list all of the reasons. You're breaking that person's confidentiality. And so what you should say, what you could say is the employee is no longer with us. You know, the board, the governing board or the chief of staff, the congregation's chief of staff has discussed it with the head of the personnel committee, and you're democratically elected representatives have thought about this really carefully, and we've made a thoughtful decision in the best interests of the congregation. If anybody has any specific questions, refer them to this person, refer to the minister, or refer to the head of the personnel committee or the head of the governing board. But the governing board head or that person should be very careful not to disclose protected information. And this is where you want your minister or those folks who are ministering to your congregation to pay special attention, because your congregation, the members of your congregation, need emotional and ministerial support. They don't really need to know all of the gory details behind the termination of one of your employees. So this is something you may want to talk about before and have an understanding at your board level, at the personnel committee level, before you ever have to let anybody go. And last slide, please, Lisa.
Well, and just the other extra wrinkle in this is that if the minister, for example, is the chief of staff, it becomes even more complex because they may be the one recommending this, and yet they are also the person who needs to be available to minister to the various factions, possibly, of the congregation. So it's a good thing to enter into with lots of knowledge and foresight.
Absolutely, absolutely. So some resources, I suggest that every congregation seek out and find a good employment attorney, an employment attorney in your state who understands your state's specific labor laws. You don't want just a general real estate attorney or a general attorney. You want a labor-specific attorney. It can be very inexpensive. You don't have to have somebody pay a lot of money to have somebody on retainer. It could be that you just seek out somebody, introduce yourself to them, let them know who you are in case you ever have any trouble, so you can reach out to them at that time of trouble so that they're not unfamiliar with you. And it's also helpful if they have some background in church law as well, because church law is very different from many parts of the labor laws. Your district staff, Lisa, is an extraordinary resource for you. Please reach out to your district staff. They can be incredibly helpful for issues around conflict, evaluation, doing startups, and thinking about when you're getting ready to hire, think what are the kind of things you need to think about after you've made a hire, getting those folks up and running. So use your district staff as a resource. The Office of Church Staff Finance, as I mentioned, should be your go-to folks for any issues around compensation, benefits, and tax law, or tax issues. They're great with tax issues as well. And here's a number of books for you that could be particularly helpful. They tend to be, they're all books around church employment. So Barry's Alban Personnel Handbook for Congregations, Bloss's Church Guide to Employment Law, Richard Hammer's Church and Clergy Tax Guide comes out every year, and this is one of the most important books you can have in your personnel library at the congregation. Gil Rendell and Susan Beaumont's When Moses Meets Aaron is specific to congregational employment issues, and Westing's Church Staff Handbook. These are all great places to do some light reading if you'd like. And so with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions. I really appreciate your spending time with me and Lisa this evening. Feel free to reach out to me at any point for any questions. Here's my phone number and my email, don't hesitate.
Well, Rob,
to call.
Okay, great. Jennifer added a question here. What about outsourcing HR at the congregational level?
I think that's a really good question. There's certain things you certainly can outsource. Payroll administration, for example. There are payroll services who will handle not just timekeeping and payroll processing, taxes. They'll set up your taxes. They'll do the state reporting for independent contractors and your employees that I mentioned for garnishments and things like that. If you have any of your employees who are garnished, they can handle those things as well. Some of them are operate those professional employee organizations, which are basically HR-like functions for you, and you pay a little bit of money to them, but they basically act like you've got your own HR manager for your congregation. They tend to be a little bit impersonal, but certainly having a payroll service is the first place that I would start. ADP, www.adp.com, and Paychecks, www.paychecks.com, and Paychecks is Paychex.com. They both are great payroll services. We use ADP at the UUA, and ADP, it's the nation's largest payroll service, and they work with very small employers and they work with enormous employers. So they're very familiar with, with small employers like congregations, and they can help do benefits and things like that as well. So it's certainly worth looking at. You'll pay a little bit of money to them, but I think it's money well spent. So definitely worth exploring. Other things to outsource, you might have a consultant that you outsource things to, like recruiting, putting together job descriptions, putting together personnel manuals and things like that. And you can pay by the piece. You can, hire an HR consultant to put together a personnel manual. You can hire a consultant to set up job descriptions, to set up an appropriate compensation or evaluation systems for you. My recommendation to you is, if you do anything like that, is that you make sure that your consultant has a real familiarity with church employment, because the issues around compensation, benefits, policies, the legal issues, and certainly around evaluations and hiring of church professionals are so different from most other organizations that you'd want your consultant to have a bit of expertise there. But it's well worth exploring, Jennifer.
Are there any other quick questions in the couple of minutes we have left here? I don't know if anybody's madly typing or if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question. But while we're waiting to see if anyone is madly typing a question, I want to let you know that I will be sending out an email to you all that has an evaluation of this evening's webinar. We'd love you to fill that out just so we can figure out if there are any wrinkles we need to get out of how we do these, and also suggestions for other webinars. I don't see any other questions coming up. So, Rob, I really want to thank you for doing this. It's been great both evenings. I've learned a lot, and I keep on making the list here myself of all the things I have to check out that the district might not be doing quite right. And I'm sure that this has been very helpful for everyone else. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you, Rob and Lisa.
Thanks, everyone.